Lecture you guys are probably going to be enjoying. It's kind of more up your alley. We're going to be just sticking in the scriptures mostly, talking about a few historical details. And we've gotten to the point where we're talking about internal evidence for the truth of the Gospels and Acts. So we're going to start off with our Bible verse again to remember that Peter tells us we did not follow cleverly devised tales or myths. We made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. So if he's going to claim to be an eyewitness, then we want to see that he was familiar with the surroundings, familiar with the political situation, familiar with the historical situation, familiar with the geography and the topography and all these other things, all right? And that's what we're going to see this morning. So here's our chart that we talked about. Last time we talked about non-Christian sources and incidental confirmations. This morning, we're going to talk about undesigned coincidences, and we're going to hit some of these supposed contradictions in history and supposed contradictions internally in the Gospels as well. So why are there 4 Gospels? Have you ever asked yourself that question? Why are there 4 Gospels? Why don't we just have one? Why didn't God just give us one big biography of Jesus? Why did he give us 4? I think there's a good reason for that. I think there's many good reasons for that, but I'll give you one this morning, because I think it's one of the ways that God helps us to see that they are eyewitness details because they interlock with one another. And then can we tell by comparing the 2 passages of Scripture with one another that both are authentic, credible historical resources or records? See, here's what the skeptic's going to want to say. He's going to say, all right, look, you got these gospel writers, they sat down, they had a common document, most of them call it Q or something else. They copied from that document, and then, Matthew copies from Mark, and then John copies from the rest of them. They copy from each other. We're going to show this morning why that's pretty ridiculous and pretty much impossible to think about that. So the first answer, we can find passages where 2 different writers tell the same story, perhaps even in the same words. You ever read the Gospels and been like, yeah, I feel like I've read this story before, because you're like, yeah, I have in the other Gospel. And this is where they'll say, oh, well, one was copied from the other. So how do we rule this out? Undesigned coincidences. By the way, I'm going to flip through some of these slides. This whole presentation, the slides and everything, I'll give to you. All right, so if you want it, like I said, email me. So don't worry about trying to copy all this stuff down. Some of the stuff we'll just flip through. Now, if this was a fiction and forgery, right, let's just, again, you're making it up. You're totally just making up the Gospels, and you're just writing a story because you want people to think that Jesus was God. Why would you leave these open-ended questions? Some of them we went over last time. Why would you leave your readers in doubt? Because if you're just making it up, then you can go in and just make up more details to fill in the story. Why would you leave out certain things? And so it's not written like fiction or forgery. So let's give an example. I kind of just wanted to get to this. Let's start giving examples. Matthew 8. 14 through 16. When Jesus entered Peter's house, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick with a fever. He touched her hand. Fever left her. She rose and began to serve him. That evening, they brought to him many who were oppressed. So, if the people believed that Jesus could heal sick, why did they wait until evening? All right, look. I just heard somebody who was supposed to be here was sick the other day. Right? If we knew that Jesus was here, and that Jesus literally just touched this guy and healed him, and he really wants to be at the seminar, why would we not take this guy to Jesus immediately? Why would we wait?
First off, it takes time to get the word out, and then it takes time for them to get there.
Well, it does, but it says they waited until evening. I mean, these people all knew about it. I mean, rumors were spreading. You read this around context, I understand what you're saying, but they knew. But because in the evening, Jesus gets bum rushed with everybody in town coming to say, I want to be healed.
Doesn't Mark tell us it was the Sabbath?
Bible scholar. Mark 1, 21 to 29 to 32. On the Sabbath, when he entered the synagogue, he was teaching. Immediately he left. He entered the house of Simon and Andrew. That evening at sundown, they brought him all who were sick. It's a Sabbath. The Jews, abiding by the law, were not going to do something like that could break the Sabbath. So they waited until sundown, which is when they would say, the Sabbath is over. So good job, Terry. 1 point for you and your team. So we're gonna have this little chart that we're drawing out. The point of this chart is to show you, all right, look, if we just had, this is a cumulative case. So if we just had, let's say, Mark confirming Matthew, right? Then we could say, well, Matthew wrote first and then Mark came in and filled in detail later, right? But what we're going to see is that Matthew will confirm Mark, and Matthew John, and John Matthew, and Luke Mark, and Mark Luke, and it's all interlocked. So then the question would be, who copied from whom? Because they're all filling in details from each other. One coincidence might be an accident, but if you have a bunch of them, then it's not an accident. Luke 9. They kept silent and told no one in the days of anything that they had seen. This is about the transfiguration. Okay, stop for a second. You're following Jesus. You go on the mountain. You wake up from your nap. You see Jesus shining in all of his glory, talking to two of the greatest figures in your traditional history, Moses and Elijah. And you keep your mouth shut. Why? We don't learn that from Luke, though. You see, we take some of these things for granted because we're familiar with all the Gospels. But just think about this. Luke's writing this, and you just look at that detail and go, what? Why? I mean, just take Luke without the other Gospels. Why would they keep their mouth shut? Mark tells us Jesus charged them to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. Now, as a side note, why would Jesus do that? Jesus was managing, this always confused me about the Gospels when I first started to read them. Like, why did Jesus tell people, like, don't tell anybody I just healed you, don't tell anybody I'm the Son of Man yet? He was having to very, closely manage, what I call balancing on that razor edge, giving people just enough information so they could say, this guy's got to be the Christ. But not so overwhelming that they wouldn't crucify him. Because he still needed to be crucified, right? I mean, if he got people to believe that he was the Christ but then wasn't crucified, well, it kind of defeats the whole purpose. So he had to very much manage his life to kind of have enough time to be there, to teach the people, and to train the future leaders, but then also kind of manage that tension so that he would die. And notice that he couldn't just die by any way, right? He had to die how? By being hung on a tree. And he couldn't die just any time. He couldn't be killed in August. He couldn't be killed in January. He had to be killed when? At Passover, exactly. So Jesus was managing his life. That's why sometimes he retreated away from the people or got away out of Jerusalem so that way they wouldn't come and mob him and kill him. So Mark gives us the command but doesn't say whether they obeyed it. Luke records their obedience but omits the command. So here we have Mark confirming Luke. All right? And the case grows. This is a setting for the 5,000 in Mark. He said to them, come away by yourselves, a desolate place, rest a while, for many were coming and going. All right, many were coming and going. And then they had commanded them all to sit down in groups on green grass. So about that green grass. Anybody ever been to Palestine? Right? See a lot of green grass? Yeah, I don't think so. What about that? Now, John tells us, John 6:4, now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. So the weeks just before and after the Passover are the growing season in Palestine. We're not necessarily used to this in our country, like rainy seasons and dry seasons sort of thing. Maybe some places here, but not all of us. I know not me. So at the Passover the season, as we talked about before last time, Josephus would tell us millions of Jews are coming to Jerusalem. Probably not millions, but even if it was 1 million, maybe even 500,000, that's still a huge crowd. So you got all that foot traffic on those roads. That's why Jesus said, hey, let's get away. Let's get away from all the hustle. Let's get away from all the crowd. Let's pull off here to the side and kind of have some time just alone with our people. And it was at the Passover, which would have been the rainy season. So they get an incidental detail, right? So we got John here confirming Mark. You see how this is growing? Okay. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, this is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead. This is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. Number one, why is Herod talking about this matter to his servants? Why wouldn't he talk to, like if you're a king, why are you going to be talking to your servants about this sort of stuff? And then number two, how would Matthew know what Herod had said to his servants? We answered this question yesterday. Do you guys remember?
Yes.
All right, so we got a little head jump on it. You remember. So we talked about Joanna, the wife of Huzzah, Herod's household manager. She was one of the people who helped support Jesus and was there with the followers. So we would say, hey, church people talk about each other all the time. Why wouldn't the pagans do it? Not that she was a pagan, but I think you get the point. So we're growing. Matthew 11:21. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have been repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. What mighty works? When you read Matthew, at Matthew chapter 11, You know nothing of any mighty works Jesus does in these two towns. So why is it that Jesus can then condemn these towns? Because if you're just reading the Gospel of Matthew, you're like, well, wait a second, Jesus. You haven't done anything in those towns, not that we've read. Does anybody have any other Bible knowledge to think about what Jesus might be talking about?
Wasn't that near where the feeding of the 5,000 took place near Bethsaida?
Yes, ma'am, it was. You got some good students there, George. So the setup for the miracle is going to have to do with money and food. We're going to take a little interlude here, but she was right. So which disciple do you pick? All right, let's think about this. You're about to have the feeding of the 5,000. It's got to do with money and food. Which disciple would you pick? Judas, right? So Judas has got the money first. He's one option. I could think of two other options. Matthew, tax collector, right? I mean, hey, here's a guy who was used to handling money, lots of it. Maybe we pick Matthew.
Peter, the fisherman. Yeah,
Peter, right? Well, we say Peter just because Peter's kind of seeming like he's a leader a lot of times, or at least he's the first one to speak up. He's kind of got some extrovert nature about him. So maybe Peter. Right? So Peter, Judas, Matthew, maybe one of those three. But in John, we realize that Jesus said to Philip. Now, outside of like the first part of John, when we realize the calling of Philip, we don't get much information about Philip. Philip's not really a big character in the Gospels. So, is this just Jesus trying to make him feel included? You know, is he like an outsider? Like, oh, come on, Philip, you get to pick where we eat for dinner. You know? Why pick Philip? See, this is where those little minor details come into play. And it's really cool. All right, Luke chapter 9, we learned some more details. We're going to piece all this together, so this is kind of like a trifecta one. When they returned, the apostles told him all that they had done. He took them and withdrew apart to a town called Bethsaida. All right, so this is the setting up of the feeding of the 5,000. So now we learn from Luke that not just that it's a feeding of 5,000, but that it's in the town of Bethsaida. Right? Now remember, where was the cursings? Or what were they over? Chorazin and Bethsaida. So now we're learning that, oh, okay, one of the reasons why Jesus cursed Bethsaida is because he had actually done a miracle in that town, the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. But then in John chapter 12, when we read a totally different story, totally different context, has nothing to do with the feeding of the 5,000, these came to Philip, who was from where? He asked Philip because he goes, Philip, this is your neck of the woods. Where's good to eat? Right? I mean, hey, look, if I come here to Peru, Indiana, and I want to know, hey, where's the best place to eat, I'm going to ask somebody who's from where? Peru. All right? Hey, man, you're from here. You've lived here for 20 years. Tell me a good restaurant. I'm not going to ask the guy from West Virginia. All right? I'm not going to ask the guy who's from Michigan. I'm going to ask the guy who lives here, who has some history here. And in fact, that's what I always do whenever I travel places. I try to ask the locals. We're like, where's a good local place? Because I like kind of getting off the map and finding local places. So here we have an incidental detail that actually confirms some stories for us in the gospel. So it's kind of a summary. Luke doesn't mention Philip, but John doesn't mention Bethsaida. Only by putting them together can we understand why Jesus speaks to Philip in John 6. And then we get back to our mighty works. Matthew, he arranges his material thematically. And this is, if you want to study about this, I'll point you to sources, but it was completely common for sources, historical documents around this time, so it's not out of the blue for the gospel writers not to write strict chronological order, okay? We think that way because that's how we write biographies. Abraham Lincoln was born here, here's his childhood, here's his young life, his college life, early career, and like that's how we write. That's not how the ancients always wrote. So they would bunch things together thematically. That's why Luke, the Gospel of Luke's a little bit different, because he says, I wrote chronologically. But Matthew often arranges his stuff thematically. All right, so he tells us, though, about the feeding of 5,000 in chapter 14, even though the feeding of 5,000 happened before Matthew chapter 11. Does that make sense to you? So we get Matthew's arranged by themes. In Matthew 11, he curses the towns. In Matthew 14, he tells us of the miracle, but the miracle happened before Matthew 11. And you go, oh my gosh, that confuses me. Well, I'm sorry. That's the way Matthew wrote. Blame him. Only by comparing Luke's account do we discover that the feeding actually took place before Jesus pronounced the woes. All right, because Luke wrote chronologically. So here we have some more interlocking. See how it's growing? So again, what, did Luke come after Matthew and just confirm him? Well, then we got Mark confirming Luke, and we got Mark confirming Matthew, and John confirming Mark. I mean, they're just all interlocking here. Let's move on to some others. So, Mark 14 and 15, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that's made with hands, and in 3 days I will build up another not made with hands. And those who passed by, this when Jesus was on the cross, derided him, wagging their heads, saying, Ah, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Now, you can go through all the synoptics, right? The three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and you get nothing for a pretext for these accusations. Now, we all know the answer because we read the Gospel of John, right? You take the Gospel of John out of it, and you just go, hey, I get to this point where Jesus is on the cross and they're accusing him of wanting to destroy the temple. Where in the world does that accusation come from? We know, because we've read the Bible, right? Gospel of John chapter 2, that's when Jesus says to the Jews, or the Jews say, what sign do you show us for doing these things? Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Now, of course, he was talking about the temple of his body, but like a good liberal will always do, they will twist your words, and they will lie about you. And so John gives us the original statement of Jesus, but not the use as an accusation. When John tells about the passion, he doesn't tell us about the accusation. But the synoptics tell us about the accusation, or I'm sorry, they tell us, about the accusation, but not the original statement. So here again we have John confirming Mark. All right, when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? You remember this scenario? After Jesus is risen from the dead, he's sitting there on the beach, and he's sitting there asking Peter, do you love me more than these? Now, again, most of you guys probably know the answer to this because you've read the rest of the Gospels. But if you just read the Gospel of John, you say, why does Jesus ask Peter if he loves him more than the others do? Not, do you love me more than you love the disciples? That's not what he's saying. He's saying, do you love me more than they love me? Do you really love me the most out of everybody, Peter? Why does he say that? Jesus can be pointed sometimes, can't he? And Jesus can kind of be confrontational and upfront and in your face. But he's not really just begrudgingly mean. That's not really Jesus. There's times where we say, well, that was kind of mean. But he's not hurtful mean. Why would he do that? Well, we know the story of Peter. What had Peter done just a few days or weeks earlier? Denied him 3 times. But we don't learn that from John, do we? We learn that from Matthew. So again, sometimes we read the Gospels as if they're basically, we read this as one book. Well, we need to remember there are 4 different books here. So Peter answered him, and though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away. Now this is Peter being a little boastful. Hey, look, man, they might all deny you, but I love you more than all of them, and I will never deny you. Well, of course, his foot was stuck in his mouth, and he denied Jesus 3 times. So when Jesus rises from the dead, he looks at Peter and goes, now, Peter, do you really love me more than they love me? Jesus is God, and God is a God of second chances, and third, and fourth, and fifth. Amen? Amen. All right. So here we have another confirmation. Matthew confirming John. All right, Luke 23. They began to accuse him, saying, we found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ a king. And Pilate asked him, are you king of the Jews? And he said, you said it. Now, this can be taken one of 2 ways. And it doesn't matter for what we're doing, but I just want to give you those 2 ways. Number one, it could be Jesus basically saying, yeah, you said that. That's right. The other one could be kind of one of those, I'm neither going to confirm nor deny, but by saying that, I'm confirming. Right? Hey, that's what you say. Wink. That's kind of how that statement can be taken. Okay? But in both instances, Jesus is pretty much saying, whether explicitly or implicitly, yes. Then Pilate goes out and says, I find no guilt in this man. Okay, let's stop for a second and think what just happened. The Jews make a grave accusation. You want to claim that somebody's a king against Caesar? That's treason. Pilate says, hey, do you claim to do this? Jesus says yes. Pilate says, okay, you're innocent. Anybody find a problem with that? What's Pilate thinking? Are you serious, Pilate? Now these Jews are going to go to Caesar and they're going to say, hey, Pilate's okay with somebody being king and you not being king. Why would Pilate do that? Does anybody know?
That's what he said in Matthew, or John.
Yeah. So we learn in John 18 another detail about the story. Pilate entered the headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered, "My kingdom's not of this world." So he says, "Okay, you're claiming to be a king. Are you really king?" And Jesus goes, "Yeah, I'm a king, but not that sort of king. My kingdom's a spiritual kingdom. It's not a physical kingdom." And Pilate went back outside of the Jews and told them, "Oh, I find no guilt in this man." Because Pilate's like, "Oh, you're one of those spiritual guys. All right, you're a religious dude. So you're not worried about some sort of physical kingdom. Okay, you go ahead with your superstitious stuff. That's fine by me." Right? Pilate doesn't care. So in John's account, Pilate's question to Jesus seems to come out of nowhere. Right? Because in John's account, again, we get Pilate coming up, "Are you king of the Jews?" But we don't read in John of the Jews saying he claimed to be king. So you're like, why would Pilate ask him that? So in John's account, Pilate's question seems to come out of nowhere, but Luke gives the accusation and not the full answer. John gives the full answer, but not the accusation. So again, this is where Luke confirms John and John confirms Luke. So we would ask the skeptic, who copied from who? Did Luke copy from John, or did John copy from Luke? Because they confirm one another. Do y'all understand that? Just do this to make me feel good. All right, I like it. All right, John. All right, and then to press this point even further, John 18 tells us that Peter cut off the ear of the high priest servant. You guys remember that? You know he was left-handed because he totally missed. Right? He swung that thing and like just chopped the dude's ear off, completely missed his head. Bad aim. John 18:36, Jesus says to Pilate, "If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting." I don't have a copy of first century playground rules, but I'm pretty sure chopping somebody's ear off would be considered fighting. Wouldn't you? So how could Jesus say that with a straight face? How could he say that?
Because he told Peter not to fight.
Well, he did tell Peter not to fight, but his servants were still fighting.
He would be encouraging it.
Think.
He healed the guy's ears.
Yeah, exactly. There's no physical evidence left. Jesus said no more of this. He touched the guy's ear and healed it. So let's think about this situation. Hey, look, if my kingdom were of this world, Pilate, then my people would be fighting. And Pilate goes, "Well, I heard your people did fight. They chopped off a dude's ear." Where's his ear at? His ear's still on his head. And you think those guys come up to Pilate and go, "His servants are fighting us. They chopped my ear off." And he goes, "But your ear's still connected to your head." "But he chopped it off." "How is it still connected to your head?" "Well, Jesus healed it." Get out of my presence. You know? Okay, put yourself in Pilate's shoes for a second. So, Peter could not be arrested for the assault, nor Jesus contradicted in his claim because there was no remaining physical evidence. So again, we get some more interlocking. All right, so just to go back right there. So you see again, Luke's confirming John, and John, Luke, Matthew, John, Mark, Luke, Mark to Matthew, Luke to Matthew, John to Mark. They just interweave. You can't say that one copied from the other. You can't say, "Oh, Mark wrote first, and then everybody pulled from him," and then it's just not the way it seems. And if you're making up forgeries, you're not going to leave all those open details. You're going to fill them in, right? At least that's what makes sense to me. All right. Alleged historical errors in the Gospels. Proverbs 18:17. The one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him. This is what Terry mentioned before. I can't remember whether we were just talking or he mentioned it to you guys, so I'm going to bring it up. A lot of times when these kids go off to college and they run into skeptical people, they only hear the attacks against the Bible, and they don't have a chance to hear a defense. What we need to do is we need to teach our young people not just the answers, but we need to teach our young people how to think. We need to teach our people this proverb. Hey, before you make your mind up about something, you need to hear both sides of the story. And that's not just about the Bible, that's just in general. Before you accept a rumor about somebody you know, maybe it's best to talk about them and hear their side of the story. Okay? So we need to teach them how to think. So this is our map again. We're here. So we dealt about, remember the positive evidence? We get some statements in the Gospels. I wonder why that happened. Oh, we learned from history some historical backdrop to it. So that's positive evidence. We just went over undesigned coincidences. So we show when we bring the Gospels together, they interlock, they don't copy from one another. Now we're hitting negative evidence. This is where somebody will come against the Gospel and go, the Gospel's wrong here because they got this detail wrong. And we'll say, you don't know what you're talking about. This is probably like one of my favorites. This is why I put it first. Mark 7:31. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. Now, when I was going through George Falls School here at Summit, and I was doing the Diploma in Biblical Studies, I'll be honest, George, I hated the map thing. I hated it because I felt like such a child. I felt like, man, what's next? Finger painting? You know, like I was coloring in these maps. I'm in Bible college. I'm coloring. I was like, I'll color outside the lines. I don't care. I'm a rebel. But I have hence learned the wisdom of my elder, because it really does, when you put the visual with your hands and then your hearing as well, you really do learn geography. And geography is actually good to know, and here's one example of it. So skeptics will go, okay, straightest or shortest point between two lines, or between 2 points, shortest distance between 2 points. Holy smokes. Straight line, right? Easy for me to say. So Jesus goes from Tyre to Sidon down here. Now, some may answer, and you know, it may be true, the Gospels tell us that they're not trying to give us every detail about Jesus' life. There's many things Jesus has said and done which could fill up the books of the world. Maybe Jesus had a friend in Sidon. Maybe he had something he wanted to do in Sidon they just didn't tell us about. Maybe. I think there's a better answer. Yeah. But why would he go up this way and then down to Bethsaida rather than just come in here? Now, this is where you'll get, the critics will say, many interpreters have noted. By the way, many interpreters. Truth's not decided by majority vote. I don't care how many interpreters think that it's awkward. What evidence makes them think it's awkward? That's the key. Okay? So don't do, most scholars think. I don't care what most scholars think. I don't care what the evidence is. Have noted this awkward route as evidence that Mark was unfamiliar with the geography of Palestine and Galilee. Now, it's important for him to be familiar with it because he claims to be what? Either an eyewitness himself, or at least talking to the eyewitness, and we know from Mark that it's Peter, or at least that's what we're thinking. So if he's saying, hey, I got my message from eyewitnesses, well, your sources are bad if they don't even understand basic geography. So it seems difficult to believe that a person living as educated enough to produce a gospel would be unfamiliar with the geographical relationship between Tyre and Sidon. Oh yeah, that sounds great. And then you get kind of annoyed when you really study this out, because you're like, here's this guy, Adam Wynn, who's probably sitting at his desk in some office, and he probably went on Google Maps and pulled up that map, and was like, oh, I'm so smart, when he really should have done a little bit more homework. Here's why. And we already gave you the first response. Maybe that's a fair response. A fuller answer. There's a mountain, 3/4 of a mile high, right there. Shortest distance, straight line. Or you can go around. Now, I'm going to tell you why Jesus went around. 2 things. So there's Mount Meron, elevation almost 4,000 feet high. This is a topographical map, a modern map. This is Tyre, this is Sidon. You see how this is like elevated? This is flat. Can you guys understand that? Okay. So if you come up here to Sidon, you can actually drop down, and there's a pass right through here where you can skirt around this mountain. Why would Jesus want to do that? Here's a I guess a better map. You see Mount Meron right here. So you see how Jesus could have gone right here and just dropped down? There's 2 reasons why he would have done this. Number 1, because you don't always want to be a mountain climber, right? But we don't often think about this second one, which is close, fresh water. Because I got a whole case of waters in my truck right now for when I came up here on this trip, and I got some here in my cooler, right? And if I ran out, I'd just go to the store and pick up a bunch more. Well, they didn't have Walmarts. And they didn't have gas stations every couple miles, right? And so what's this right here? What runs right here? The Jordan River, right? If Jesus goes up through this way, he's going to have to be a mountain climber, and you're not going to be near fresh water. Or, and by the way, Tyre, which is on the coast, is by very definition where? Sea level what? See? 0 elevation. And when you come over here, you're actually dropping down again to pretty much sea level again. So you're going way up and way down. Or you could walk up the coast, an easy walk, and then drop down here by fresh water and be able to follow it all the way down. So our moral lessons: before you criticize the knowledge of a first century author who's traditionally supposed to have lived in Palestine, make sure you get your geography right. Just saying, you might want to check a better map. Number 2, Mark 10, verse 12. If she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. This is Jesus teaching on divorce. Anybody find that weird? Somebody tell me that's why that's weird. It's usually the husband, and why?
Jewish women don't divorce.
Jewish women don't divorce. What does the law of Moses give provisions for? The husband putting away a wife, but not the wife putting away the husband. So here we find in Deuteronomy 24, there's nothing for the woman to divorce her husband. So how can Jesus say this? Now, of course, he's God, right? We get that. But why is it that he's bringing this up?
It's in
Well-
Mark, which is written to the Romans.
Well, that's true.
The Romans could divorce.
That's true. But I think there's also an added detail to that. Some say, well, Mark was a Gentile and he betrayed his ignorance of Jewish law, right? Or he's deliberately changing Jesus' teaching to make it relevant to a Roman audience. Or, this is what the critic states, this sentence is generally regarded as an addition to Jesus' teaching that was made to address situations related to Roman legal practice whereby a woman could initiate divorce proceedings. So what they'll say is, Jesus never said it. Mark, who's writing to a Roman audience, will have said, let me make this relevant to Romans. Let me put something in Jesus' mouth. Now, would that kind of create a little bit of hesitation on your part to believe that the gospel writers are telling us Jesus said things that he never said? I would not like that. That would make me a little skeptical now about, well, what did Jesus really say? What can I trust? Josephus tells us that Herodias took it upon herself to confound the laws of our country, so she went against the Jewish law, and divorced her first husband in order to marry Herod Antipas. We also learn about this in the Gospels. How do we know that? Who was killed for preaching against that? John the Baptist was preaching against this, right? Herod was Tetrarch of Galilee, the very place where Jesus was then teaching. Think about the historical situation of this. Jesus is only a few years younger than John the Baptist. John the Baptist was just beheaded for telling Herod, you can't do this. This is unlawful. And he's killed. And then Jesus gets in Galilee, the very place where Herod is ruling, and they ask him about divorce, and Jesus just, this is the original, situation of what God wanted. Here's what the law of Moses says about divorce, and if a woman divorces her husband, that's adultery too. Jesus is taking a direct shot at Herod and letting the people know that's not okay. I think that's pretty cool. So again, what we see is not that the gospel writers were ignorant of the cultural situation. Rather, what we see is that the gospel writers were more familiar with the cultural situation than scholars who are walking around today. So the moral lesson, basically, before you conclude that an author, has made an error, maybe you should learn a little bit more about history before you start making judgments. All right, objection, Mark 14. In the description of Jesus' trial, there are several points that have been claimed to violate Jewish law. Okay? So they go, whoa. You got all these details. Sanhedrin, they could only hold trials in the temple, but Jesus wasn't tried in the temple. They couldn't hold trials during Passover, but this was during Passover. There was no 24-hour waiting period, right? I mean, they immediately rushed Jesus to do trials on him. The charge of blasphemy is anachronistic. That means nobody would have thought that saying you were the Son of Man was claiming to be divine in the first century. That's something that people thought in like the 3rd and 4th century. So this is a 3rd or 4th century writer writing what he would have thought is blasphemy, but that's not what 1st century people thought was blasphemy. Okay? So that's what they mean by that. All right. Let's point this out. Point by point. Oh, let me also mention, you know where skeptics get all these from? They get it from a document, let me see if I have it here, the Talmud, called the Sanhedrin, a document in the Talmud called the Sanhedrin, which was actually written hundreds of years after Jesus, right? So you get a document that's written after the time of Jesus that tells you the customs of the Jews, of their day. Not of the 1st century day, but of their day. You guys following me? Yep. So which one's anachronistic? It's kind of a little deceitful to find a Jewish document written after the time of Jesus and saying, well, these must have been laws of the Jews in the 1st century. They may or may not have been, but you can't just make that leap right there. So let's take a stop. Let's just say they were. Let's just say they were. The trial was held at night, not in the temple during the Passover without the 24-hour waiting period. All these points shows that the trial of Jesus was a kangaroo court, right? And that the Jews didn't always follow their own rules. And look, the Jews didn't always follow their own rules. You can read here in Josephus. Don't quote me on this one. You got me on tape, so don't quote me on this one. I think that this reference is about James being martyred. That they waited until some rulers were being kind of transferred in Judea. Some Roman rulers were kind of switching out, and they waited for a gap in Roman rule, and then they killed James. I think that's what that has to do about, but you can go read that for yourself. The point is, the Jews didn't always follow their own rules. So all this shows is that they jumped up, a kangaroo court in order to kill Jesus. Big deal. E.P. Sanders argues on the basis, and that's the Sanhedrin I told you about, that the description of Jesus' words before Caiaphas cannot be authentic, for it would not have been understood as blasphemy by the Jews at the time unless Jesus uttered the divine name. So let's look at this. Mark chapter 14. Jesus said, I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Does anybody know the Bible references that Jesus is referring to? Psalms 110, the Lord said to the Lord, notice that, when you have all capital letters of the Lord, what is it referring to? Yahweh. So Yahweh says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for my feet. The Lord said to my Lord. But then in Daniel chapter 7, you guys are familiar with Daniel chapter 7, right? We get this, I saw in the night visions, behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. See, that's where we get that phrase from. A lot of people think Son of God means Jesus was referring to his divinity, Son of Man refers to his humanity. That's not true. In fact, the Jews of Jesus' day probably would have understood it the other way. They would understand the phrase Son of Man as being divine and Son of God being a person who is either holy or has divine favor. For example, you remember the Roman centurion who was there at the crucifixion of Jesus? And he said, and after he sees all that happens, what does he say? Truly this man was the Son of God. Well, that's an interpretation put in there because there's no article. Truly this man was a Son of God. Now he could have been saying, just because there's no article doesn't mean he's not saying he's the Son of God. Maybe he was. Maybe he was like, man, this guy's the Messiah. But is it likely that a Roman centurion might have made that statement? Not likely, possible, maybe. Maybe he would have done it. My opinion, more likely that he was saying, man, I've just seen this guy being beaten, scourged, crucified, people railing against him, and look at what he did. He took it like a sheep, whose mouth was shut, and he even prayed for these people while on the cross, and he looked at a criminal, and he told to him, you're going to be with me, it's okay, and he encouraged him. This guy was a holy man. That's what I think. But regardless, the point is, Son of Man phrase comes from Daniel 7. He was given authority, glory, sovereign power. All the peoples, nations, and men of every language worship him. You shall worship nobody but who? But the Lord. So the Jews understood Daniel 7 figure as being divine. So in the Jewish context of the first century, the phrase Son of Man would have been understood as divinity. And guess what's funny? This is not just a Bible, thumping guy like myself saying it. Our buddy Bart Ehrman, our skeptic Bart Ehrman tells us the phrase Son of Man in the first century was divine. The Jews would have said, you just said you are God. Yes, sir.
That was kind of more than divine, though, because it was a unique description to the Messiah.
Yeah.
So that's like saying this is the Messiah.
Yeah.
Only, that's the only way it was used.
Yeah. So, yes, sir, Terry.
I don't want to break your train of thought, but you mentioned the Talmud.
Yeah.
I think it's worth mentioning that by the time the Talmud was written, the Jews are trying to discredit Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
There are things in the Talmud that are there. So when you're looking at the Talmud, you are looking at a biased source to begin with.
Yes, you are.
That's worth pointing out.
Very much so. I agree. Good point. So I just think it's funny that we got Bart Ehrman, and God always loves to do this. He always takes skeptics and then uses their words to help confirm Christianity. So we got Bart Ehrman, who's a skeptic, who will definitely tell us the Son of Man is an ascription to divinity. So that's just a couple quotes by some other scholars that are saying, look, Jesus' claims there before the high priest, he was saying, I am God, I am the Messiah. I will be vindicated by God the Father when he tells me, sit at my right hand and rule beside me. So he's quoting in Psalms 110, he's quoting Daniel 7, and he says, you're gonna kill me, but I'm the Messiah, and you will see me vindicated by God, and I will come in judgment. You wonder why Caiaphas said, we've heard it. We need no more. Moral lessons. Claims about what a first century Jewish audience could not have understood as blasphemous must not be made without very full knowledge of the historical context. Okay? So learn what the Jews really thought before you make critical statements about what the Jews really thought. Matthew chapter 2. The story of the slaughter of the innocents of Bethlehem is found in no other gospel. It's also unmentioned in the works of Josephus, who gives a very lengthy and detailed account of the life and death of Herod the Great. So this is called an argument from silence. And arguments from silence are always what? Weak. They're always weak. So here's the argument. If the slaughter of the innocents had really happened as Matthew describes it, we would have first century sources that mention it. We don't have those first century sources, therefore the slaughter of the innocents didn't happen. Well, premise 2 is true. We don't have other first century sources. But is premise 1 reasonable? I don't think so. Why? Most of the literature from Palestine has been destroyed. You have to understand they did not have paper like we do. They did not have computers. They did not have scanners. They had documents, and their documents were very fragile. And unless they were stored in a dry climate and sealed, most of the time they're going to deteriorate, especially after 2,000 years. All right? So a lot of stuff from the first century has just been destroyed. We're at the mercy of what has survived. Bethlehem was an obscure village. It's probably no more than a dozen children that were killed. Now that's not trying to downplay what happened there. It's terrible that maybe 12 or 15 children were killed. But in the grand scheme of things, if you really read about Herod, this guy was a paranoid, homicidal maniac. And if you got a guy who's like that, right, and he's killing people, he's killing family members, he's killing all sorts of people, and if you're Josephus, why are you going to mention then that he kills a few kids over in an obscure town in the middle of nowhere? Now, again, not trying to downplay it. For us, that might be big because we're like, oh my gosh, those are kids, or that's, related to us because of the whole Jesus story. But again, if you're a Jew or if you're writing a Roman history, you can't put every single detail in. And so just because Josephus doesn't mention it doesn't mean it didn't happen. In fact, I know that because Josephus and Philo, another writer, both pass over the expulsion of the Jews from Rome. You remember in Acts chapter 18? Remember that story? That little detail we get in Acts 18:2, where you get all the Jews are kicked out of Rome? Josephus and Philo don't mention that. But look, all historians acknowledge that event took place. You won't find a historian that says, no, those Jews kicking out of Rome, that story's made up. That's not true. Everybody understands that story happened, but neither Josephus nor Philo mention it. So this is why arguments from silence are bad. If a writer mentions something, he only has a few motives. Either he what? Believes it really happened, or he wants you to believe it happened. If he doesn't mention something, he has all sorts of reasons why he doesn't mention it. Maybe Josephus didn't have room in his scroll. Maybe he ran out of room. Maybe he didn't care. Who knows? Maybe he says, that's not to what I want to write. Maybe he wrote it in another document, and that document got destroyed over time, and he didn't want to repeat himself. There's all sorts of reasons why Josephus or Philo might not have mentioned it. So arguments from silence are bad. All right, we'll do this one. We'll end with this one. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar. You can't type in like errors in the Bible or errors in Luke or census or something like that and not come up with this one. The whole like census in Luke is like a big one. This is a big one on what people point to. Oh, the Bible got it wrong. So Luke mentions in Luke 2:1 that Caesar Augustus, he made a decree that all the world should be registered. The NIV says the entire Roman world should be registered. This is another reason why I don't like the NIV. Because that's called an interpretation. So the objection is that Caesar Augustus never ordered all the world or all the Roman world to be registered. Well, let's look a little bit closer at that phrase. What does it say? It says that the whole oikumene, the whole land, was to be registered. Now, when you read whole land, you have to do some interpretation. Your NIV did an interpretation for you. They take the whole land to mean the whole Roman land. What could it also mean?
Palestine.
The Judea.
It could mean all of Judea. It could mean the whole Roman world. It could mean another, like you have to figure out by context, what does it mean? Or maybe you look into history and say, what actually happened? Well, we actually learned that Luke uses the same phrase in Acts 11:28. There would be a great famine over all the... Okay, so what does he refer to in Acts 11? Where's that famine at? Only in the land of Judea. That's why Paul was traveling around collecting an offering for the saints who were in Judea. So Luke uses this same word to refer to only the land of Judea. So it's not out of our ability to reason and say maybe that's exactly how he was using the word there. Well, we can continue to expound upon that and actually see from history. I think there's good reason to think that. Judea was under the control of Herod the Great during this time. He was a client king in good standing with Caesar. So Herod would have been allowed to levy taxes himself. So Augustus would not have issued this decree. That's what's going to be argued. Hey, look, Herod was in charge. He's in good standing. Since he's in good standing, Caesar's not going to step in. Caesar's going to go, that's your control. I got other things going on. There's a reason why I appointed you over that. I don't need to micromanage, right? But was he in good standing? We learned this from Josephus, chapter 16, book 9, paragraph 3. Near the end of his reign, Herod fell out of favor with Augustus, who sent him a sharply worded letter telling him that whereas he had treated him before as a friend, he would at that point treat him as a subject. What had happened is Herod was kind of in a war with some people on his border, and those people had went to Caesar and appealed to him and told Caesar, pretty much they slanted the story only to be pro-them and anti-Herod. So Augustus only got half the story. Now Augustus has never read Proverbs where it said, one's man's ways seem right until another examines him. And Caesar took their story wholesale and looked and told Herod, that was messed up of you, that was wrong, blah, 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 blah. And so he said, essentially he said, I'm demoting you. And if he demotes him, that means Herod no longer has the right to levy taxes. Because if you have the right to levy taxes, that means you're the one getting the income. Now Caesar's punishing him and demoting him and saying, you no longer have that right. Rome's going to take that right from you. And so, at this time, we also learned that the Romans required an oath of allegiance to Caesar from the citizens of Herod's domain. Now, we're drawing an inference here. It doesn't state this explicitly, but it makes sense that if Caesar's going to take Herod out of power, kind of demote him, you're still going to be in that area, but I'm demoting you. I'm going to now be in charge of taking these taxes. That the Roman government would make the people of that land swear an allegiance to them. And that's just something that the Romans did. This is why the Christians got in trouble in the first century, not because they worshiped Jesus as Lord, but because they were too stubborn to say that Caesar was Lord. Study your history, that's pretty cool. We weren't killed in the first century because we said Jesus is Lord. So the Romans, they would have been like, that's cool. We got 400 lords, or whatever. We just want you to say, read the martyrdom of Polycarp, one of my favorite stories in ancient history. They didn't care. They said, well, whatever, you can bring Jesus as Lord. Just put your fingers behind your back, cross them, and just say Caesar's Lord. You ain't even got to mean it. All right? So this is something that they did all the time. But within a year or so, Josephus reported that Herod... Now look, Herod was a very cunning guy. He wasn't stupid. He hadn't been in politics that long, his whole life, and he wasn't cunning. So what Herod did was he sent some delegations, and Augustus rejected him. He sent some more presents and delegations, and Herod rejected him. But then he kept pressing, and finally Herod sent just one guy who was very smart and very wise and witty, and he gets in, he's able to get an audience with Caesar, and Caesar goes, all right, look, I just want to know, is this what happened? And the guy was very, very intuitive of what Caesar was asking, and he answers him in a very good way. He says, all right, look, it is true, but you didn't get the full story. And so he's able to kind of word it in such a way as not to insult Caesar, like, well, you lacked wisdom for only accepting half the story. He was able to basically be like, you know what, you were right. Herod did some bad things, but let me give you a fuller account of what happened so that you can make a good judgment. So he's kind of like propping up Augustus so he does, working on his pride sort of thing. So Herod was actually able to get back in good graces. Now, question. They didn't have like immediate emails and Facebook and all that sort of other stuff, so things worked a little bit slower. You're Augustus, you look at Herod, you demote him, I'm going to now levy taxes. So you start the process. It can't happen overnight, right? You got to send new people down there. You got to get people registered. It takes a while. So you start the process, but then Herod wins you back over and you put Herod back in charge. What happens to the taxation process?
It was to Herod now.
You kind of put a stop on it.
Yeah.
You go, okay, well, let me table this for a minute. Herod's getting back in. Let's see how that works. We're going to table that. That seems like a pretty likely scenario. So here's the answer. This registration was probably only in Herod's dominion, not empire-wide. We learned that from the word usage of Luke. It may have been ordered when Herod fell out of favor with Augustus. That's something that we inferred, but I think that's a reasonable inference. This explains the oath of loyalty to Caesar that Josephus mentioned, because that would have been out of the blue, right? Just randomly, Caesar goes, all the people in Judea have to tell me that I'm Lord. It makes better sense that he did that because of what was going on. All right, now we're going to finish this objection by hitting this. This is the second part of the objection. The next verse in Luke says, this was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Here's the problem. But Quirinius didn't become governor of Syria until 6 AD, 10 years after Herod the Great was dead. So how can a chronological blunder of 10 to 12 years be explained? So the tax of that we read that Augustus started was like 10 years before this. But Luke tells us that this happened when Quirinius was governor of Syria. So Luke got something wrong here. It couldn't be when Quirinius was governor of Syria because it was 10 years too late. So what is Luke doing?
Governor twice.
And you know what? I didn't put that answer in here because it's a little bit more speculative. And just for the sake of time, I kind of took it out, honestly. But George mentioned maybe Quirinius was governor twice. It's a possibility because there were times that Josephus tells us when there's a governor of an area, but Caesar doesn't necessarily trust that guy, so he sends in another delegate, and it's kind of like they're working together as co-governors, because Josephus actually has a point where he talks about two guys as governor at one time, and one guy was named Quirinius. Could be that Quirinius had a previous governorship earlier on. Could be. I think there's a better answer, and so you can judge this for what it's worth. I don't think that might be it. So before we answer, Luke knows that Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great. He tells us that in Luke 5. Okay, so he knows that this is like 4, 5, 6 BC, somewhere around there. Luke knows that. Luke also knows about the taxation under Quirinius in 86. He mentions it in Acts 5:37 again. So it's not like Luke is ignorant of these historical details. He's familiar that these two episodes happened. So I don't think it's likely that then he made a blunder about it. Reading the actual language there in Luke chapter 2, all the original Greek was in capital letters, and all the words were bunched together. There were no spaces. Okay, and these breathing marks, you see this little mark right here, and this little mark right here. You guys see those accent marks? Those come later. Okay, to help for pronunciation. These two words look exactly the same, don't they? This is pronounced alte, and this is pronounced halte. See the difference? Alte, halte. The difference in the reading would be this was the first census, or the second one would be the apographe itself was first made. And I'm going to tell you why that's important. The term apographe, which you read as census there in Luke chapter 2, can either mean a registration or a taxation involving a registration. So it's where you use the part for the whole, right? President George W. Bush invaded Iraq. Did Bush invade Iraq?
No.
You're using a part for the whole.
Right.
You're using him as kind of a figurehead to say, we, as America, we did, right? And he didn't do it on his own. Obviously you got to get Congress to agree. So use a part for the whole. That's how words are used. So apographe can either mean a registration or it can just mean the taxation part of the whole process. So the process would be you register and then you're taxed. What I'm saying is that the word can mean just referring to that second part, the taxation. So an admissible reading of Luke's Greek here is that Quirinius, a decade later, picked up the matter that was dropped off in 6 BC. This is where we bring it all back together. So let's summarize. Herod gets in trouble. He gets demoted. Augustus is now going to levy taxes. Herod's cunning. He gets back in good graces. Augustus tables the taxation. Quirinius comes in 10 years later, picks up that taxation process, and brings it to completion. people were already registered. We know that because what do we read in Luke chapter 2? Joseph and Mary, where do they go? Bethlehem, right? So we know people went and registered, but they actually were never taxed. So Quirinius comes along 10 years later and says, okay, let's finish that process now and actually tax the people. So I think that's what Luke is meaning. And he uses this word, agenata. This is a verb, and it means to come to pass. Right? So it's like when the famine was talked about. Do I have that up here? Acts chapter 11, verse 28, when the famine is talked about. The famine was prophesied about earlier, but then the famine came to pass. So it seems as if what Luke is really saying is, this is when the taxation itself finally came to pass. Does that make sense to you? So it's just more of a translation thing. You get a little bit better understanding with the historical details. And so that's all the consequences of it. So more probably, Luke intends to convey that although the census was aborted in 6 BC, it was picked up and carried through to its completion, the taxation itself, under Quirinius. Any questions? Terry?
I'm not saying that this is the case in this situation, but if somebody were to say 100 years from now, you know when Bush invaded Iraq, are we talking about 1991?
Oh, yeah.
Or are we talking about in the 2000s? And which Bush are we talking about?
Yeah.
And so, you know, centuries later, and this does happen, and sometimes in biblical things, where biblical in the Old Testament, there's places where a guy's name, and you look through the historical records, and you find out actually there's more than one guy with that same name that was the ruler of this country at different times. And so skeptics will say, well, couldn't have been this guy. Yes, but there was another guy.
There's actually an example of that. I didn't get to this objection, but it's in the PowerPoint. It's about Lysanias being, I think it was tetrarch. I think that was the word, over Abilene or Abilene. And essentially, it's like, oh, he had the wrong date. Well, no, it's because they're looking at the wrong Lysanias. There was multiple Lysanias, you know, there around the time of Jesus, and it's not that one, it's this one. So you're exactly right.
I mean, imagine if we had a couple hundred years from now, some of the records are lost.
Yeah.
And at that time, they only know about one of the Bushes.
Yeah.
They don't know about the other. And
so we need to remember that history, we don't have a complete record of history. We have to go into it assuming that there are details that we just don't know about.
Yeah, same thing with Jeroboam 1, Jeroboam 2.
Yeah. Exactly. Those are good points. Those are good points. Okay, let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. Let's try to make it like 7, if we could. And then, and yeah. No, just go ahead and take a 10-minute break. We'll work it out. And then the last session, my favorite one.
question and answer.
Yeah.
Don't forget about papers on here for question and answer.
Oh, yeah.